This video is part of a series that discusses a few literary theories in an introductory capacity. Don't expect any nice flashy visuals, as this is pretty much a slideshow with some voiceover. This video will discuss context-centered approaches, and it is intended to help someone understand the basics behind this literary theory. This entire video also only makes use of one reference, the Unisa study guide for the Introduction to Theory of Literature. This video is technically meant to help students doing that module, but it should be educational to anyone who wants to learn a little about literary theory. According to the current study guide, all the information on context-centered approaches can be found on pages 94 to 102 and 124 to 128. So, without further ado, let's get to it. Okay, so this time we don't have a special theoretical term that signifies a specific theory, like Romanticism, Russian formalism, or New Criticism. This time we are looking at so-called context-centered theories. If Romanticism is sender-centered, meaning it focuses on the sender, i.e. the author of the text, and Russian formalism and New Criticism are message-centered, meaning they focus on the message, i.e. the text, then what does a context-centered approach focus on? Well, the context. I know, complicated stuff, but what is the context? That is probably the most important question here. The context is very basically everything outside of a text. Technically speaking, you could argue that Romanticism, with its focus on the sender, is a context-centered approach. It focuses on the author, after all, which is part of the context. However, let's look at it like this. The context is what makes each individual component of a text make sense. A word only makes sense when it is surrounded by other words, which form the context of that word. Think of the word house. On its own, we know that it means a building people live in, but it doesn't hold any further meaning than that. Well, what if I put that word in a sentence like this? I live in a house. Now, all of a sudden, the word house has gained additional meaning because of the context of the words around it. We know that this particular house is one that people live in, specifically the one I live in. So, what happens when I take that sentence and I put it in a paragraph? A paragraph that then explains what the house looks like. Suddenly, house has gained even more meaning because of its context. Furthermore, that paragraph only makes true sense within the context of the other paragraphs around it, which only makes sense within the context of the chapter those paragraphs are in, and those chapters only make full sense within the context of the book. That book may also be you're part of a series of books, and that book only makes complete sense within the context of the whole series. We can go even further with the context. We can say that collection of books only makes complete sense when we also take into account the person who wrote it, the society that author lived in, the time period in which that work was produced, the conditions under which that author wrote that book, etc. That is the context. This is why we might be able to learn certain things about the world by reading books from specific time periods or countries. A book set in South Africa is going to have a different meaning to one in Croatia or France or the Philippines, etc. This means that there is far more to a text than just what is in the text itself. This is what context-centered approaches focus on. They focus on the extrinsic features of a text, the things outside of it. And they generally assume that there is some kind of a causal relationship between the context and the finished text. This means that they assume that the contextual landscape in which an author wrote their text has a direct influence on what that author wrote. Therefore, those extrinsic features directly influence the intrinsic features. This is something the Russian formalists and new critics would have vehemently opposed. How dare you claim the world a human lives in influences the stuff they write? How dare you? Now, you may be thinking that context-centered approaches is a rather broad label, and you'd be right. This is why you could argue that things like feminism, post-colonialism, postmodernism, etc. are context-centered approaches because they are more interested in what a text has to say about the rest of the world. But we will not focus on those for now, and will instead speak in general terms. Perhaps one day there will be a video explaining the more specific theories, but for now we shall do this instead. What are some of the contextual things that can influence a text then? We can break these down into institutional, cultural, social, and political contexts, and sometimes we like to throw together fancier terms like socio-political because we academic types are real fun. Institutional contexts Or all the things that exist at a more business-like level, the norms, traditions, and conventions of various mediums. For instance, how do you expect a movie to be shot? How do you expect a book's chapters to be laid out? How do you expect a song's structure to be used? There are certain norms that we feel we need to follow because that's the way the institution has laid it out. Literature produced in certain places, like at universities, are expected to be highbrow, academic, boring books, aren't they? You don't expect some university professor to produce a tabloidy magazine. You expect him to write a dense, difficult-to-read tome about some philosophical concept that no one really wants to read about except a few boring people. And by the same token, you don't expect someone who's made silly comedies their whole life to suddenly write a dark story about trauma. Imagine if Adam Sandler one day made a movie like Schindler's List. You'd wonder what happened to the world while you were asleep. What about cultural contexts? This is a little different, but quite similar. What are the expectations, norms, beliefs, traditions, etc. of a certain culture? We expect women to write stories about women, black people to write stories about black people, gays about gays, lesbians about lesbians, transgender people about transgender people, white men to write about whatever they want, because there tends to be a lot of misplaced confidence in white heterosexual cisgender men. But these are expectations that also often inform what someone is writing about. So we might read a book like Ben Okri's Dangerous Love and understand that he, as a Nigerian man, is writing about Nigerian people in Nigeria, and so it makes sense to understand the cultural norms of Nigeria, the history of Nigeria, the ethnic groups of Nigeria, etc. It is rather understandable why we might focus on some of those contextual aspects, those cultural contexts. The same goes for social contexts. Now, social contexts and cultural contexts have a lot of overlap, but then again, all of these have a lot of overlap with one another. But social contexts are those things like social structures, organizations, economic, legal, religious, and educational differences. When we read something like J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, we understand that it takes place in post-World War II New York City, and so there are probably some social aspects to life that we should understand. We need to understand how the protagonist's education may have led him to do what he did, how his economic situation influenced him, etc. But those aspects go hand in hand with understanding all of those same things when it comes to the author and how he wrote that book. How did his education, upbringing, social circumstances, and the world around him lead him to produce a character like Holden Caulfield? And lastly, or at least in this generalized overview, the political context. What kind of political and economic system produced the work that was produced? Would the literature that came out of fascist pre-war Italy be the same as the literature out of a democratic pre-war French political context? Two books may have been published on the same day in 1944, but one is from Germany and the other is from the United States. Would the literature be similar or vastly different? A great example of this is to look at the officially endorsed art of the USSR. It was illegal to create anything that could be considered subversive by the Communist Party, and all literature was meant to reflect party ideals. So, do you think there were many books released during that time that painted capitalism or democracy in a good light? Probably not. Another example might be the politically charged and incredibly racist white supremacist books like the Turner Diaries that have been released in the United States over the last few decades. Were those written because they were trying to be great pieces of storytelling, or because they were trying to propose a political message of some kind? So, how do all of these things affect pieces of literature? How do they affect texts that are produced? If a government or large organization were to offer funding to artists, would more artists be able to create art? Would that make the art better or worse? Would it do neither? What would it do? What would happen if a book was praised by institutional experts? For instance, if a book won the Pulitzer Prize, it would probably see a spike in sales. If a specific author is considered to be part of the canon, and historians discovered a new book 50 years after their death, would that book be considered great simply because of its association with the author? Imagine if they discovered a long-lost Shakespearean play tomorrow. Would that play immediately become part of the Western canon because it's a Shakespearean play? And some of these things, such as social or political contexts, do they change over time? Would the literature from Germany in 1920, 1930, 1940, and 1950 be different to each other? Would it change with the rise and fall of the Nazi Party, with the beginning and the end of the Second World War, with the separation of Germany into East and West? How would the context change, and how would that context affect the work that it produced? A great example of this is to look at literary trends. Enlightenment literature eventually disappeared. Realism eventually appeared and then disappeared. Modernism appeared and disappeared. These literary periods are applied retrospectively because we cannot often tell what world we're living in at present. For instance, some have suggested that we live in a post-modern world now, which is a ludicrous name and someone needs to come up with a better one. But in 50 or 100 years, we might be able to carve out specific periods and specific trends in literature. We can even do it on a smaller scale. There was the rise of teenage vampire fiction that came in the wake of Twilight's success, but that faded and was replaced with those battle royale dystopian things, with the Hunger Games leading the charge. The various artists follow trends, and you can see how those trends affect literature as time goes on. That is the context. That is what you would look at when focusing on a context-centered approach. Now, you can argue that the reception of art is a form of contextual analysis, but we're going to leave a proper reception theory for last in this small series on literary theory. But let's end off with one final contemplative thought. All the theories we've looked at so far are more about analyzing a particular text to understand that text, but contextual theories are more about placing a text within a specific context so we can understand both the text and the context. So, does that make a text less artistic? Does it turn art into just another thing that we can use to understand society? Does it turn art into a cultural object that does not have much meaning outside its own context? There isn't an answer to that, but it is a small thing to think about. And that comes at the end of the video. I know, right? So fun. If you enjoyed it and you want to learn more things from me, a random person, then you can just do the subscribing, other things, comment. You can also comment. Anyway, yes, that is the end for today. And next time will be the final video on this brief introduction to literary theory. Have a wonderful day further.